So roughly 10,000 baby boomers will turn 65 today, and about 10,000 will cross that threshold every day during the years from 2010 to 2029. In 2015, millennials became the largest workforce generation, and millennials will be 75% of the workforce by 2025. So I bring these things up just to say that we really are in a period of a lot of generational change. This graph kind of helps explain that and just gives a visual to that. Here you can see that big spike there is the quote baby boom, that when people came back from World War II, young couples started having children at a rapid rate, and we had a lot of births during that era, and that's the baby boom. There's a dip in the middle there that is the Gen Xers, where there weren't as many children being born, and then this other peak there is the echo boom, and those are basically the children that those baby boomers were having, so they're also larger in numbers, and that's Gen Y, or those millennials. There's just, and you can see this another view here of sort of what that looks like in terms of actual population numbers in that view as well. But as you look at this image, there's just, what this image represents is a lot of organizational change too. That as we're going to really in a period of flux here, as one group comes in, other groups, as one group goes as kind of moving out of the workforce and other groups are moving in, what had been the status quo for several decades is just shifting. And I think organizations are kind of starting to feel that change. And that impactful organizations are trying to think about, how do we manage that? How do we be better communicators around that? And try to figure out how to best approach that mix of the generations in the workforce. So that's our purpose today. My purpose is to give you a sense for the generations, some perspectives about how to navigate that, and to really kind of provide a space for you all to dialogue about how that's playing out in your work groups here at DECA. So my name is Erin Blocker. I teach business communication at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. So I'm located here in the Kansas City region, but I've had the opportunity to give this presentation and have these dialogues about this topic with the Lawrence office and the Oklahoma City office. So I'm excited today that we're going to tackle this topic with a lot of folks from Wichita, but it sounds like we may have people from other locations tuning in as well, so that's great. So I have a master's in communication from the University of Kansas and a graduate certificate in executive coaching from the University of Texas in Dallas. And I love talking about these kind of sociological communication topics with people when I get to go out and do workshops with people in organizations. So today is a real highlight for me. And I will also share with you that I am a millennial. So I was born in 1981. I'm 39, which means I'm a very early millennial, or I guess an elder millennial. I'm on the old end of the millennials. As we go through today, I want to look at three things in particular to give you a snapshot of the 5 generations, and that's going to be a little bit more talking on my part. I'm going to that would be more of a informational part of the session. So maybe give kind of an hour of information. And then the other 2 hours, I want to look at what are some communication strategies you can be using for each group, and then how can we do some customizing within your offices for how the company can best customize to each generation. So that's kind of where we're headed. But I did want to just start with quick introductions. And I know we've got a big group, so we'll be sort of fast about this. But what I'd like for you to do is if each person could come up and just briefly tell me your name, your role within the organization, and then which of the generations you identify with. And I'm going to put that here in the chat. So you can see what the sort of age and years are. You do not have to tell us how old you are, but you can just tell us generally where you think you fall and which group you identify with. And then I'd like to have you give me just in one word that you would use to describe your generation. So we'll keep this pretty brief, with just a few sentences for you to tell us what your role is, and then one word you think you would associate with your generation. Crystal, what would be the best way to do this? Should I just sort of call names out down the participant list, or?
Yeah, if you want to do some stacking and just call out from our list, then I think that would probably be the best, and that gets people ready.
Great. Well, I've got you first on my list. Would you be willing to kick us off?
Sure. So my name is Crystal Dalmaso. I sit in the Wichita office. I am the South Central community support specialist with prevention. And I'm on the very old end of Generation X, but she said I didn't have to tell you exactly what my age was. And I think that my generation is really hardworking.
Great, thank you so much. Next I've got Chrissy.
Hi, I'm Chrissy Mayer, and I sit in our Community-Based Services Division. I am a part of Generation X, and I would say we are very independent.
Ah, great. Next I've got Dina.
My name is Dina. I am in traffic safety for Oklahoma, and I am a millennial, and I would say that they are innovative.
Thank you. Catherine.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I work in placement in Lawrence. I'm a millennial towards the tail end, and I would say that my generation is very outspoken.
Let's see here. Diane.
I'm Diane Bourne. My office is in Wichita. I'm Director of Operations, and I would be an early Gen X-er, and I'd say we like to get things done.
Yeah. It looks like we have Dina Trotsky.
This is Dina Kemp, and I'm a Southeast Kansas Community Support Specialist for DECA, and I'm based out of Winfield, and I am Gen X, and I'm gonna say fun-loving.
Okay, good. Joy.
I'm Joy Schwartz, Community Support Specialist for Southwest Kansas. I am a baby boomer, and I'd say we're loyal.
And is it Carrie?
It is. Hi, I'm Carrie Jackson. I am in the Lawrence office, and I'm in the Finance and Accounting Department, and I'm a baby boomer, and I'm going to say retirement bound. So you can hyphenate that and make that one word.
Yeah, great. Let's see here. Every time someone speaks, they jump off my list, and then I lose where we were. See, Krista.
Hi, Krista Machado. I'm with Prevention here in Lawrence, and I'm a millennial, and I'd say that we're a variable population.
Lori.
Hi, I'm Lori Moriarty. I am a Gen X. I work with prevention and traffic safety both. And I would say that Gen Xers are pretty chill.
Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle Talley. I work at the Lawrence DECA office. I'm in placement and recruitment and some training. I'm a Gen Xer. I believe that we are dynamic and resourceful, worthy of wearing many hats.
Yeah. Mike.
Hi, my name is Mike Parsons. I'm in the Lawrence office. I'm the prevention program coordinator. I am a Gen X, and I would say that we're very open-minded.
Okay. Sarah.
Did you say Sarah?
Yeah.
Oh, hi. I'm Sarah. I'm the office assistant for the child placing agency foster care in Wichita. I am a millennial, and I think we're innovative, creative.
Tasha.
Hi, I'm Tasha Foster, and I am the HR benefit specialist here in Lawrence. I am Gen X, and I would say we are dependable.
And it looks like maybe last name Stanley. Is there somebody who's got a screen name of S. Stanley? Might not have them with us. Anybody in the Lawrence office at the phone number want to come on and share with us?
There we go. Oh, this is Sherry Stanley.
Oh,
I'm
great.
in the Lawrence office, and I am a baby boomer. And Carrie kind of took my word that we are retiring, but I think in our young days we were wild and free.
That's a good one. That's a good one. I think I did a poor job of managing the list here as names moved around. So please, anyone come forward who I missed? Anybody that hasn't had a chance to speak yet?
Hey everybody, this is Laura Moore. I'm in Topeka at the Traffic Safety Office. I'm a millennial, but I deny my generation because of the stereotypes that are attached to that. But in here, I'll claim it, I suppose. But I think that the older millennials, if you will, like, we're pretty strong-willed.
Yeah, good. Great. Well, I like your all's assessments. I think you've hit upon some themes that I think will continue to play out here. Before I jump into the snapshots that I want to share of the generations, I've got some what I call limitations, because I think looking through the generational lens is really useful, but there are some limitations to it. So let's just start with that. For the next few hours, I want to give you permission to say it's okay to talk in generalities. We're going to try to zoom out to see the bigger patterns. Normally in life, we do our absolute best not to stereotype people, but I'm going to give you permission for the next few hours, and in a way, we're going to stereotype each other and say that by being born in a certain time in the United States, we share a certain worldview because of that, because we've all experienced certain key historical events at the same time that shape our general outlook. So it's okay to kind of talk in generalities for the next few hours for that reason. I want you to think about the difference between generation and life stage. So every generation is going to go through each life stage. Each generation will be young, they'll be middle-aged, they'll be older. So we want to try to figure out what's the difference between what is actually that generation's perspective or their worldview versus what might be common to anyone in that particular life stage, or how is that generation experiencing a certain life stage. I think that sometimes talking about generational differences does not always account well for cultural or ethnic differences. And we can include that today in our critique. As we discuss and go through some of this, let's be harsh about that and say where we think maybe these models don't hold up for different groups or different racial experiences. An individual's communication profile is made up a lot of different layers, like a stack of pancakes. And this is one of those layers that we can pull out and look at. So, when I think about someone's communication profile, I think about maybe their Myers-Briggs type, if you've ever done a training like that, or birth order can sometimes impact how people interact or their communication. There are a lot of things like gender or other things that all stack on top of each other. But this is just one of those layers that we can pull out and sort of look at. It doesn't mean that other factors aren't going to impact your life experiences or how you see things or how you communicate, but this is just the one we're going to try to hone in on today. And then our session today will obviously have a professional focus about your office and your work relationships, but it is way okay to talk about personal examples or things from your own formative experiences or your own family, because those really are the things that tell us what we know about our life and our worldview. So please bring in those personal stories today too, and that's just fine to do. Well, I'm going to start with giving a snapshot of each of the generations, and I will say this is where it might be I'll do my best to keep it engaging, but this will be a little bit more of an informational section. Know that we will do a lot more talking and interacting later. So starting with the snapshot of the 5 generations, I want to start first with the silent generation. So this group was born between 1920, and for each of these, I'm going to give you their timeline. I have a timeline designed for each of these so that we can figure out what was the historical context going on during the formative years of that generation, and what would be some of their defining moments. And then we'll look at what would be some famous faces in that group that we would all recognize and know. And then we'll look at what would be some of the hallmark traits of that generation. So not comprehensive, but just what are some of the highlights we could say. So starting with the silent generation. So born between 1920 and 1940, between the ages of 80 and 100. And obviously this group is kind of waning from the workforce generation, but I like to include this still because we still find them in volunteer roles, in leadership roles, or sort of chairman of the board type roles. And I also think all of the other generations cue off of some of the experiences from this generation. So if we don't talk about them, it's hard to understand everybody else. So some things that impacted this group. Truly, this is a generation that saw the advent of electrification and telephone infrastructure spreading, especially in rural Kansas. There are some areas that really did not receive that infrastructure until the 1940s, 1950s. So, seeing that sort of advent of those technologies, when you think about the life experience of someone like that, they may have seen electrification come to their county in Kansas, within their lifetime. Obviously, the stock market crash, the New Deal under FDR, World War II is probably the biggest defining event for this generation. But they really came of age and began their lives as adults under the post-war prosperity that happened after World War II that brought us the move to the suburbs, and the baby boom, and a lot of them may have gone to college on the GI Bill. So some famous faces in this group, people like Warren Buffett, Queen Elizabeth, Sidney Poitier, Nancy Reagan, Jimmy Carter, Martin Luther King, Johnny Carson, Willie Mays, Mickey Mantle. So those are some sort of famous faces, either living or not living, who would probably identify with this generation. So some hallmark traits for this group. First, I would say a word we could use to describe them is selfless. That they were raised in an era of crisis and want during the Great Depression and World War II, where that individual identity was more subsumed to the greater good. So this is a group that was more focused for that reason on that collective experience. Things like having rations or a victory garden, that there was an emphasis on family, national events, sacrifice, thrift, going without, pay cash, save for a rainy day, reuse things. That these folks have a lot of faith in authority and institutions and the government because of these times that required such a collective act, and that people would have to put their faith in those institutions. Another hallmark for this group is that they value stability. Their outlook is really to keep their head down, work hard. When the silent generation began coming of age after World War II, they tiptoed cautiously in a post-crisis social order that no one wanted to disturb because they didn't want anything to go on their permanent records. They kept their heads down during the McCarthy era. They were also careful in the labor market. Fortune's story on the college class of '49 was subtitled "Taking No Chances." When they went to job interviews, their first questions were about pension plans. That's from an article in Forbes. And I've got that symbol of the gold watch there that I think sums up that notion, that these are folks who were really looking at how could they be part of a company for the next 40 years of their life. And that for that reason, they stayed very loyal to a company. They may have only worked for one organization in their whole working life. And that kind of led to that idea that they didn't want to rock the boat, that they might be more formal, disciplined, not as focused on feelings. Another trait for the silent generation is that they were a prosperous generation. They had really lucky timing. And I want to share some financial statistics with you that sort of help to tell that story of how this generation came to have such a high quality of life. They were able to lock in really low fixed rate mortgages when they bought their first homes in the 1950s and 60s, just before inflation hit, giving them decades of income from owning their property. They signed up young for defined benefit plans that their GI managers had started. Their midlife savings were in these high savings decades during the bull markets of the 80s and 90s. And then they were able to retire and sell out just before the crash. The very last year of the silent generation reached retirement age in 2007. So they just slipped in before the Great Recession. And basically what this means for this generation is that they might be the financial anchor in their multi-generational family. They may pay for the family vacation that multiple generations go on together. They may have set up college trust funds for their grandkids. So it's possible that silent generation, because of this prosperous experience they have really been able to be a financial center for the rest of the family. Woody Allen had a saying, he's a member of this generation, that 80% of life is just showing up. And I think for some people in this generation, it really was, that they could achieve some prosperity and comfort in life just by sort of checking the boxes and doing what society was asking them to do. The next group, the baby boomers, and I heard that we had some of this cohort on the call, which is great. So for these folks, born between approximately the years 1940 and 1960, this is one where we see a little bit of leeway. I kind of like to look at it in the decades. I think that helps us just get a nice clear cut of where it's an easy way to think about where things start and finish. Sometimes people will play with the end of this and say that it goes through 63 when sort of at the end of the Kennedy administration, but approximately ages 60 to 80 right now. So for this group, obviously grew up and they were children during that post-war, that era of post-war prosperity. They experienced things like rock and roll, the space race, the Cold War. I think a real defining moment for this generation was the Vietnam War, either serving in it or perhaps activism around it. And then this was the first generation where we really saw women entering the workforce in large numbers. Some famous faces for this group, people like Oprah, Steve Jobs, George W. Bush, Bruce Springsteen, Marcia Clark, Condoleezza Rice, Larry Bird, George Brett, Bill and Hillary Clinton. Some traits for the baby boomers. One, I think, what's really important about them is that they are often leading trends in society. And the reason is there are so many of them. When you look at that graph that I showed you when we started out, you could just see how there are so many people that fall into this cohort that they really dominate the landscape for society. They dominate advertising and marketing and all that kind of stuff. There's so many of them that society is often focused on whatever their life stage is. So when they were young and getting married and starting their households, society's focused on that. When they're, in their 30s and 40s and raising children, society's focused on that. When they're retirement age, society's focused on that. And when they were children, society were particularly focused on them. There was a huge 1950s child-teen culture because there were so many children at that time. And I've just got a few images up here to sort of represent that. And one that really comes to mind for me is that green fondue pot. I know my parents had had one of those they got as a wedding gift, and their first home looked a lot like that image there. But I know that for my baby boomer parents, it seems like society sort of tracks with them, and whatever life phase they're in, there's a lot of the world that's focused on that. Another important trait for this work is that they're very dedicated to work. They identify with their career and don't see it just as a job, but as it's not just a job, but it's an end in and of itself. They're known to work really long hours. They said that this generation invented that 70-hour work week. They show a lot of dedication to their organization. They really like collegiality. They're kind of reluctant to go against their peers. This group has seen a lot more, but despite this dedication to work, this group has seen a lot more debt accumulation and had sort of a buy now, pay later attitude that their silent generation parents didn't necessarily share. So that's an interesting distinction between the baby boomers and the silent generation. This group questions authority, and I think that comes from some of those formative experiences they had with Watergate, the war in Vietnam, and that they're more apt to question authority and distrust government than the silent generation. The baby boomers also like big ideas, and that also comes from the formative experiences they had. Within their formative years, they experienced things like the moon landing, the civil rights movement, the rise of computing power, and I think those things really expanded the baby boomers' horizons and gave them an attitude to say big things can happen and nothing is impossible. And I think that makes this generation really idealistic, in a good way. And Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak of Apple, I think, are two people who are kind of a symbol of that idealism and that big picture thinking. Generation X. So for these folks, born between 1960 and 1980, approximately ages 40 to 60 right now. So when we look at their timeline, they are impacted by the fact that they are the children of women who are part of the women's movement and joining the workforce in large numbers for the first time. So they're sort of impacted by that, by women's move into the workforce in large numbers in the 70s and 80s. They grew up in a difficult time for America. When we look at the energy crisis, the Great Malaise during the Carter years, the recessions of the 1980s. But some other interesting things were going on too. We've got the rise of networks and network television like MTV, CNN. I would say that the Challenger disaster was probably a defining moment for this generation. And then they kind of start to begin their lives and their careers during that Clinton era prosperity in the 1990s. So some famous faces for this group. I've got the entire cast of Friends up there. Barack Obama, Paul Ryan, Michelle Rhee, Dave Matthews, Anderson Cooper, Tiger Woods, David Beckham, Michael Jordan, Peyton Manning, Sheryl Sandberg, one of the chief executives at Facebook. So they're all influential Gen Xers. So some traits for this generation. One would be that this group is sometimes categorized as indifferent. They have kind of a so what attitude. And that was sort of a phrase as this generation was coming up. And I think part of that is because they were coming of age during kind of a dark time for the country. Like I mentioned when we looked at their timeline, things like the Iran hostage crisis, the Great Malaise of the Carter administration, high gas prices, the recessions in the 80s. This was kind of a dark, gritty time for the country. Not a lot of optimism sometimes in this group. Instead, I think sometimes Gen Xers are more apt to be realists. They're going to be the realists in the group. They have a really good problem solver mindset, and they're sort of savvy. I've got another quote here to share, this one from Time magazine. Gen Xers are known for keeping their heads down and assuming their work speaks for itself. They constantly plug along and feign satisfaction, too afraid to upset the apple cart, and that's a productivity and engagement killer. We know Gen Xers are less engaged, and that makes them sometimes less motivated, energized, and less prepared leaders. So it's interesting to think about, what does this mean for a group that has sort of an individualistic outlook? What does that mean when they step into leadership roles, or when they're trying to look at solving problems for a whole ecosystem? But I think this is a group that's very pessimistic about retirement too. Pew Research showed that 44% of Gen Xers don't believe they have enough money to retire, which is kind of a different story from that silent generation and those baby boomers. So indifferent might be perhaps a little bit more negative way to look at this group, but a positive way to look at them, I think, is to say independent. But part of this comes from sort of being what Pew Research calls America's neglected middle child. And what do we mean by that when it comes to this group? They are the smallest generation, as you can see on the graph. They're that dip, they're that valley. So there are few of them. Any room that you're in, anywhere that you go, unless it's something that's really targeted at this age group, you will notice there are fewer people in this age category. There are going to be a lot of baby boomers in the room, and there are going to be a lot of millennials, and there are just going to be fewer Gen Xers wherever you go because less of them exist. They're only about 20% of the workforce. So if we were all live in person right now and I asked the Gen Xers to raise their hand, there just wouldn't be as many of them. They're also sandwiched between two really noisy generations. And I think any Gen Xer would probably tell me they agree with that analysis, that America has always felt sort of out of sync with this generation because they've been so focused on the generations around them. We've got the noisy baby boomers, and we've got the noisy millennials, and the Gen Xers, I think, are kind of not a cohesive cohort because of that. But when it comes to their own life experiences, this is also the first generation, like I said, where mothers were probably working outside the home. And we get the idea of the latchkey kid, where they may have come home from school, let themselves into the house, made their own snack, kind of hung around until parents arrived several hours later. This group also likes to tell, kind of a common recollection for this group would be going out to, being able to play outside and just having free range of the neighborhood, and being asked to come in when the street lights turned on. Does anybody have that experience? And that's kind of different than maybe some of the hyper parenting that we see with later generations. But so what does that mean for this group? That they really enjoy doing it their own way, very independent, may come with a little bit of cynicism, like to keep their options open, more self-reliant. So that kind of changes this group's relationship to the organization, where they may be looking at, what will be optimal for me, for my family, for the people that are in my boat with me, maybe rather than a total allegiance to the company. So loyalty to self rather than to the organization could be a trend with this group. But it is interesting to know that this group, as baby boomers are retiring, these are the folks that are stepping into those leadership positions. And as we transition from having baby boomers as leaders to Gen Xers as leaders, I think there's going to be it'd be interesting to watch what that transformation feels like and what that brings. 68% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are Gen Xers, so this transformation is underway. Another thing we can say about this generation is that they are a sandwich generation. As the average child bearing age increases and life expectancy expands, Gen X is bearing the burden of raising young children while also managing aging parents more so than ever before. According to AARP in 2012, 42% of Generation X had a financially dependent child along with a parent over 65. So I think this is adding to the stress for this generation, that they really are feeling that sandwich more than other groups have. So that means they might be the most likely to use the Family Medical Leave Act. It's also interesting, though, to realize that this group is also pretty tech savvy. So even though they're maybe not quite the digital natives that millennials are, when we look at that timeline of Gen Xers in the workplace, it really tracks nicely with the beginning of the personal computer in the workplace. When I think about this group, I think of them as having been part of every single Microsoft Office upgrade. Like, they got it. They've got it going back all the way to Windows 95, So I think sometimes this group gets underestimated in how tech savvy they are, because they really understand the workplace technology so well, because their careers have kind of tracked that. Good. Hopefully everybody's still with me. Let's look at Gen Y, also known as Millennials. It means the same thing. Born between 1980 and 2000, about approximately between the ages of 20 and 40 right now. So for this group, I like to start with the image I have at the bottom of the screen, which is the camcorder. That personal video recording device came out it was first introduced on the market in 1981, and the reason I know that is that as soon as I was born, my father rushed out to buy one. And to me, that is really symbolic of that millennial generation, because we've got a whole generation that grew up having all of their important childhood moments, filmed or photographed ad nauseum, and that there's a lot of attention on them, and that camcorder to me kind of represents some of that dynamic. But some other things that this group has experienced. A lot of folks in this generation really have not known a world without the AIDS epidemic. The personal computer is a big part of their story, that a lot of them probably experienced having a computer class, or learning the computer was part of their schooling. So this is the first generation where they're learning to manipulate the computer as a school child, not just as an adult in the workplace. Their children during the sort of prosperous Clinton era in the 90s, they may have been the first adapters of cell phones during that time. They saw the rise of reality TV shows like Survivor and all of its many offspring. They kind of had to contend with the No Child Left Behind Act in the Bush years, and I think that has impacted education for many in this group. I think a defining moment for this generation is probably the terrorist attacks of September 11th. They start to launch out into jobs in their careers right as the housing bubble burst and we have the Great Recession. But they also were a big part of electing Barack Obama, and were a generation that saw as one of their first presidents in their adulthood was an African-American president. Some famous faces in this group, Mark Zuckerberg, Lady Gaga, Adele, LeBron James, Taylor Swift, Amy Schumer, Hassan Minaj, Prince William and Kate Middleton, Mala Yousafzai, the Williams sisters, Abby Wambach, Kim Kardashian, just to name a few. So some traits for this group. One thing I think is that they are special. A lot of people accuse them of thinking they are special. And in some ways, I kind of think that they are. So let's unpack that. They grew up, so 1982, Time magazine said this marked the era of the wanted child. Not since the progressive era near the dawn of the 20th century has America greeted the arrival of a new generation with such a dramatic rise in adult attention to the needs of children. And that's from Howe and Strauss in their book, Millennials Rising. So this is the time that they're growing up in. Children are really viewed as wanted, worthy, to be protected. We see things on the rise in this time period like bike helmets and car seats, things that are meant to protect children. This is the healthiest, most cared for youth generation in living memory. And it's a very child-focused 2 decades that they're growing up in. And I think what this tells this generation is that society is looking out for them. An outcropping of this is that they have a very close relationship with their parents. They're more likely to call home to ask for advice and to kind of have their parents as part of their advising team, even when they go to college or go to their first job. That they treat their parents more as friends and to have more of a peer relationship with their parents than the other generations ever had with theirs. So millennials trust that society is noticing them, looking out for them, and that people in authority have their best interests at heart. This group is also really diverse, and I think that was something that people mentioned when you told me about your perspectives on your generation. Demographically, this is America's most racially and ethnically diverse and least Caucasian generation ever. Here's a graph that shows that. You can see there as we go from the greatest generation to millennials, that rainbowing of America that's happening there. I think this generation also got a lot of early messages about tolerance and equality. And a symbol to me of that is Sesame Street. That this is a group that grew up watching Sesame Street, where a lot of messages there given to children from toddler age were about fairness and tolerance and equality. This is also the first generation to really grow up thinking of itself as global, that because air travel has become so inexpensive, and of course the rise of the internet, this generation really sees themselves more as citizens of the world, and also some things going on during their lifetime, like the development of the European Union and the EU, globalization. They may identify more with sort of this global community than they do a local community sometimes. Millennials, even though they get a bad rap sometimes, I also think they are sort of achievement focused. And let me tell you my reasoning here. Some of the No Child Left Behind legislation put such a focus on testing that I think that has translated into kind of an achievement outlook for this group. A corollary to that, though, is that sometimes when we've got a curriculum that's so geared toward testing, it leaves students with a discomfort with critical thinking and ambiguity. That this is a generation we've kind of trained to see there's a certain way to do it, there's one right answer, there's an answer to the test, we're going to teach the test, and they didn't get as much training in critical thinking, independent problem solving, maybe than those other generations did. And there's a big focus on metrics for this group. However, they are defining success differently than other generations. Whereas baby boomers or Gen Xers may have seen success as having a fancy car or achieving a certain amount of wealth or status symbols. The millennials really aren't identifying with those things. And that graph I have up from Pew Research helps to tell that story a little bit. When asked what's the most important thing in their lives, a big amount said being a good parent, having a successful marriage. I think that's really interesting because of the high divorce rates we saw in the 80s and 90s, that I think a lot of them are reacting to that life experience that they had, and then instead they're saying, I want to make a successful marriage a priority in my life. Helping others in need, and then we see some things like owning a home, having a high-paying career are lower on their list, and I just think that's a really interesting contrast to some of the other generations. So when it comes to this achieving mindset, though, it's also interesting to notice that women are outpacing boys in this generation. It's the first generation for that to happen. We look at the graph here of people with a bachelor's degree or higher. There's a place on the graph where it crosses, and the women start to outpace the boys. And I'll just tell you, in my experience as a university professor, I see this holding true, that the women take the leadership roles in the organizations. They're the one to be the organizer. They're kind of the hustlers and the go-getters. So, I don't know exactly what to make of this. I don't know if that trend continues as these millennials age in their careers, if we continue to see that pattern where they become leaders in their organizations, or if things like motherhood change that dynamic, but it's something to watch. Another trait for this group, I think, is team orientation. One word that's been used to, a phrase that's been used to describe this is the new millennial communitarianism, that they really gravitate toward group activity and having more of a group framework. Things like school uniforms, team learning, community service have, I think, impacted that. A return to the city. A lot of, we see millennials really repopulating city centers and wanting to be part of that more urban experience. But another way we can understand this is that each generation tends to fill the vacuum of the zeitgeist that they grew up in. So in the 1950s, there was a vacuum. The vacuum was individual conscience. There was a lot of sameness in the 50s. The baby boomers come in and wreck that and say, we're going to bring a lot of individual conscience to this, and we're going to be activists, and we're going to have a whole new frame. Same dynamic then for the millennials. In the 1990s, the vacuum is community. A book that was written, and some of you may have heard of, is called Bowling Alone. And in that book, Robert Putnam talks about how a lot of the social fabric in America really disintegrated in the 80s and 90s. Things like bowling leagues and the Sir Optimus Club and things like that. And I think millennials grew up in that time, and they looked at that and said, we want that, we're going to create that, and that sort of, they're filling that vacuum, the vacuum of community that they experienced. They're now sort of creating that. So what does that mean in the workplace? I think sometimes what that means is that because millennials have such a focus on a team orientation, they're less likely to see hierarchy. And I want to share this quote from Inc. magazine. Cummings 29 came from the rigid management confines of Boeing, where at least 7 thick layers of management stood between the youngest workers and upper management. By contrast, Screen Tap employees, which was the company that this article was spotlighting, of all ages, collaborate, move around, and try new roles. They're also asked to volunteer solutions and new ideas directly to the company's top brass. We're not organized around seniority, says Cummings. We're based around who can get the job done most effectively. And so that, to me, that's a really good window into how millennials think about workplace structure, that they're not as bought into what everyone's title is as they are looking at what can each person contribute. This group are definitely digital natives. They were in on the beginning of the digital world, and to me a big symbol of that is this Apple computer that was given. So these computers were given in large numbers to schools in the American school system in the early 80s. And what a smart idea, right? If you're Apple, what a stroke of brilliance to say, we're going to take a whole generation of humans and get them really familiar with our product. But what that meant was that students started to have computer class just once a week, just like they went to art class or they went to PE or whatever. So these millennials are digital natives. They've been in on from the very beginning on this. And here's a timeline of the Apple company. And you can see this is kind of the story of those millennials years. This timeline represents the millennial timeline. Now, there are some good things and bad things about this. They outpace every other generation in gadgets owned, except for desktop computers and e-readers. So some good things and bad things about this. One, I think this experience with technology makes this generation really flexible, and that they have a comfort with rapid change, because their whole lives have been a story of rapid change. That there's always something new coming out, there's always a new platform, there's always a new device. Bad things about this, though, are perhaps some immunity to the digital environment, that sometimes they have a hard time distinguishing between what's my real life, what's my online life. They may not always choose the best communication medium, because they're perhaps putting a focus on this type of digital communication instead. And I think it also leads to a little bit of discomfort with boredom. That idea that it's okay to stop and sit and be quiet and think and be a little bit uncomfortable if you're bored. That this generation has never really had to experience that. There's always been something at their fingertips to fill in that discomfort. But something I really want people to understand about millennials is that the discomfort with ambiguity that they sometimes have, because of that sort of no child left behind, there's one right answer, testing culture, is kind of paradoxical to their comfort level with change. So millennials are really good with this flexibility and change, but they're not always so good with ambiguity. And I think that a lot of times managers think that they should also be good with ambiguity because they're more comfortable with technology and change. But those are really two different skill sets, but they sort of feel like they're at odds, or there's a paradox there. And if there's one thing I could get people to understand about millennials, it's probably to understand that paradox, that it seems like they need a lot of guidance, they need a lot of help, they might not always be independent problem solvers, even though they're really flexible. Another quote from Forbes: "I know a company that had a significant issue with turnover, not because of their labyrinth of rules, but because these rules were unspoken and new hires were left to figure them out on their own and subtly punished for failing to catch on quickly enough." So millennials might not always be able to sort of fill in their own gaps about what to do or what's expected or what the workplace culture is, the way more independent previous generations did. They may be looking to have those things filled out for them. In sort of that there's one right answer viewpoint. All right, we're getting close to the end, I promise. So for Gen Z, our last group here, and I will tell you, this is one I'm still working to understand. So I'll be interested to hear from you all some of your impressions about Gen Z as you know them, as your kids, or people that you work with in your programs. So born between 2000 and 2020, approximately ages 0 to 20 for this group. So they're just starting to graduate from high school, hit our college campuses. So we might start to see them soon showing up as interns in our organizations. But I know that in your roles, you often work with young people as your clients and constituents as well. So for this group, I think some impacts for them: the rise of e-commerce, things like Amazon.com that we've really shifted away from a brick and mortar economy. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are probably, I will say before 2020, I would have said, are a defining moment for this generation. I think the coronavirus pandemic might become their defining moment instead, but probably some influence from both. For this group, when the smartphone was released by Apple in 2007, really not that long ago, a lot of these kiddos have not known a world without the iPhone or smartphone, which is really crazy to me. But things like Twitter, sharing services, cloud services like Spotify, where you don't own your record collection, you don't own a CD collection. Instead, there's a sharing service that's available to you. It's sort of a different way to look at the world. The rise of big data, obviously the election of 2016 and all of its implications. And then, as I was prepping for our session this week, I had to add that terribly scary coronavirus image that we've all been seeing everywhere, because I think, that is just going to be such such a huge impact on this generation, and we don't even know yet what a big impact that will be, that their lives were disrupted, that they're been taken out of school, that they've had a loss in their learning, perhaps, and then just a lot of uncertainty in their lives around this, and that they're experiencing that as young people. You know, we're experiencing it as adults, and it's challenging, but they're experiencing it as children. Some famous faces here. I put Boomer Phelps. I don't know if you guys remember watching the Olympics a few years ago, and his dad was a Olympic swimmer, and little Boomer Phelps was there with his little earphones on to be part of the crowd at the Olympics. Barron Trump, the president's son. All the Duggar children from TV. I got a lot of TV children here. Honey Boo Boo, Sasha Obama. Some other kids from television. Prince George and Princess Charlotte. The kid president. So there are just a few that we might know from popular culture. So let's talk about this generation. Like I said, I'm still working to figure them out, but a few things I think we could say. One is that this is a really unfit generation. In 2012, more than 1/3 of children and adolescents were overweight or obese, according to the Centers for Disease Control. This is a generation that's really grown up eating a lot of processed foods, convenience foods, and that has some interesting implications. I don't know exactly what all they will be, but interesting to think that when we, you know, all of us as we get into our adulthood sort of struggle with how to maintain our health and be healthy, but to think that we've got children sort of battling that struggle is a new problem for America. It's been listed as a national security risk for things like a draft that we really, if America had to have a draft today, like we did in World War II, military leaders have warned they wouldn't be able to do it because this generation is so unfit. We're seeing things like type 2 diabetes in 10-year-olds. You know, what is the impact of that going to be on their quality of life or their life expectancy over the next 40, 60 years? You know, we just don't know. There's also a lot of costs associated with that this could be sort of an ill generation. But we have to work to, I think all of us sort of in this time period, in the 2000s, you have to be really proactive about health. And I wanted to share something here from, I'm going to move a couple of things on my screen in order to really read this, but I wanted to just share this from a book that I was reading. I thought it kind of summed this up. And it talked about, they call it the Oprah effect, that, you know, sort of Oprah's focus on weight loss and health, and they were contrasting that to King Henry VIII. So Winfrey's success story was an inspiration both to her fans and to an anthropologist at Emory University, George Armagelos. He used it to illustrate a historic shift that he dubbed the King Henry VIII and Oprah Winfrey effect. In Tudor England, it wasn't easy keeping everyone as fat as Henry VIII. His diet required hundreds of farmers, gardeners, fishermen, hunters, butchers, cooks, and other servants. But today, even commoners can get as fat as King Henry VIII. In fact, poor people tend to be fatter than the ruling classes. Thinness has become a status symbol because it's so difficult for ordinary people to achieve this unless they're genetically lucky. To remain thin, it takes the resources of Oprah Winfrey and a new array of vassals, personal trainers, chefs, nutritionists, counselors, etc. I just like that example because it sort of says something about where we are now with society in terms of health and how is that kind of impacting this generation. I think we could also say that this group is really digitally immersed, and I've got a photo here of a little baby teething on an iPhone. Every time I go to the grocery store and I see a little baby in the cart sort of fiddling with the parent's iPhone, I go, oh my goodness, what is going on? But it's interesting that we're kind of running a big experiment on these children, right? That we are allowing them to manipulate digital devices before they even learn to read or write. And that has never been the case for any American generation in the past. I don't know if the results will be good or bad. It's interesting to think about. But what does that screen time do to developing brains and their process of language acquisition? Schools are no longer, in a lot of cases, not teaching things like cursive, which I think is interesting. If you've got young people in your life, you probably know that a lot of them don't know how to read cursive. And I think that's sort of interesting because that is the script that our Constitution, our original Constitution, is written in. It's like, does that become sort of almost like a new version of a literacy problem? If we've got, I actually had a university student come up to me a year or two ago and say, can you read this to me? I can't read this, because it was something that had been written in cursive. And it was sort of shocked me. And I thought, wow, that's an interesting version of a literacy problem. However, also some other things under this digital immersion to be thinking about. Also, how does this impact young people's social skills, their awareness of themselves, their awareness of the space that they're in, their awareness of others? You know, I often see, I think sometimes children learn they learn socialization from their parents in those downtimes, right? You're driving in the car together, or you're waiting at a restaurant for your table. And sometimes I notice parents, rather than talking with their kids during that time, they're on their own iPhone or they're on their smart device. And so they're they're missing that chance to talk with their kids. And that's where children learn how to have a conversation, how to check in with other people. So I don't know, interesting to just see how all this is going to impact them. A Time magazine article in November of 2016 had a big focus on the anxiety that this generation is facing, that we're seeing a mental health crisis among people under the age of 20 right now. And no wonder, you know, looking at sort of the landscape that they're growing up in with the recession, the war on terror, bullying events at school that might last days or weeks because they carry over onto the internet. So, you know, you used to live in a world where perhaps something negative happened to you at school and you could go home and leave that. And now those events follow people home, and they continue to play out in the digital environment. And also in the digital environment on something like Facebook or other social media platforms like Instagram, we're getting everybody's highlight reel. We're not seeing their real day. We're seeing the best version of their day that they want to show us. And I think that also has some psychological impacts for people too, as we look at how do we stack up to others. But anxiety and mental health is a big red flag for this generation, and it's interesting to see what will become of that. The last one I have for this group is just that I think it's interesting they have a wide age range of parents. So because of the advancement in fertility treatments, especially in the early 2000s, that has become much more cost effective for parents and for families. And we see more people taking advantage of that. A fertility treatment is not necessarily the purview of just the very rich. It's now something that more middle class or upper middle class people could also access. So we could have someone parenting in this age range, basically between the ages technically of 16 to 46, which is kind of wild that we could have people on huge generational spectrum being the parents of this generation. So that's kind of an interesting thing to watch out for as well. And that there could be some generational cross influence there. And that I think that the Gen Zers could all have different traits based on what cohort their parents were in that were parenting them. So they may have different traits based on what generation their parents were, basically. And that the parents might be a little bit more not as present or digitally distracted, like I was mentioning earlier. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end of me just giving you information. But I like to do that as a platform now for the rest of our discussion. I want to start by just going through, yeah.
Before we start, we missed a couple of people when we were doing introductions. Can we circle back around? We have a room full of people, and so that might capture some of those groups that you just talked about. So there was a room in Lawrence that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in it, and so I want to make sure we circle back around and get them introduced as well. Great.
So when when we began, I just asked everyone to share what generation they identify with. So hopefully you'll kind of be able to reflect on that from the presentation. And then what's one word or phrase that you would use to describe your generation? And then also tell me about your role in the organization.
Can you hear us?
There you go.
Hi, Crystal. This is Nick McGovern in Lawrence. And I believe I would be a millennial. And I think we're also free-spirited.
Okay, good.
This is Shannon Zimmer. I am the controller in the finance department. I am also a millennial, and I too would say an elder millennial, and I'd say we are fresh. Dawn?
This is Dawn Griffin. I'm in the accounting department in Lawrence, and I'm a Gen X and hardworking and dependable, I guess.
Hi, Michelle James. I work in accounting in Lawrence. I am a Gen X, and I think independent is probably the one I most identify with.
Yeah, good. Well, I'd like to take each of these generations and do a little exercise I call a chat storm, which is I want to ask everybody, and if you're in a group, you can maybe pick a representative to do it, to put an entry for your group. But I'd like to go through each of the groups we just talked about and have everybody think about something, either the people you know in your own life, your kids, your friends, your grandparents. And as we go to each of these generations, put down a trait that resonated with you from their profile. When you think about that group, what's a word or a phrase that comes to mind? Put that in the chat. We'll just have everybody do it, and it'll come up real quick, and it'll be kind of fun to see all the responses. So let's start with silent generation. What kinds of things do you think of when you think of that group? Put a word or a phrase in the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing some interesting things here. Let me give you another minute or another 15 seconds here. Yeah, great. So I saw things like frugal, hardworking, resourceful, thrifty, silent, family-focused, hoarder. Yeah, stashing money. Yep, interesting. Good. Let's do that now for baby boomers. Let's. What resonates with you when you think of sort of the people in your ecosystem that are baby boomers? What traits come to mind? How would you describe them in a word or a phrase? All right, I think our chat storm might be waning a little bit here. So I'm seeing things like dedicated, loyal, free-spirited, idealistic, creative, loyal, question government or authority, know how to party, maybe see things as black and white. Okay, yeah. Let's do this same exercise for Gen X. So when you think about those Gen Xers, what kind of things, when you think about a Gen Xer, you know, how would you categorize them? Yeah, good. Let me share some of the things I'm seeing here. So I think that word independent came up a lot. in terms of their life stage right now, they're really child focused on parenting. Problem solvers, maybe not as interested in the team dynamic, able to adapt, kind of indifferent, individualistic, looking at work-life balance. Yeah, well, that word independent, that was the hot one. Yeah. Let's do the same thing for millennials. So think about the millennials, or yourself. What are some words or phrases that you would associate with that group? Yeah. All right, so some themes here, kind of that idea that they're special and that everyone should care about what they feel and think, need or want a lot of feedback, collaborative, needy, challenge the norm, focus driven, and seeing a difference there between maybe the start and the end of that generation, open-minded, entitled, opinionated, tech savvy but want clarification, look for change, value achievement. Yeah, entitled came up a lot. So, that idea of the participation trophy. Yep, that's an interesting dynamic too. Yeah. And how about for Gen Z? What are some traits that you all are seeing with Gen Z? You might know them better than I do. You look at sort of the youngsters under 20 in your world. What do you notice about them? Yeah, so I'm hearing things like naive, lazy, learn from YouTube. That's an interesting one. Tech savvy, very electronic driven, looking for shortcuts, the idea of electronics again. Lazy, waiting for things to be presented, not self-starters, anxious, constant need for entertainment, eager, inclusive, interesting. Quick learners if info is presented in the right way, that's interesting. And then kind of this theme of like YouTube, yeah. Well, our next step is that I want to try to, care about diversity and inclusion. Yep, thank you, Michelle, that's a good one. Yes, this is great. I appreciate all of your responses there. So I think we kind of have a handle on how do we see these different groups. Part 2 of our session together now is to how do we apply this to your daily life and to your experiences as an organization. I had planned now to just give you guys a quick 5-minute break. Would that be good? Could you use that if we do a quick kind of restroom break, and let's say we agree to reconvene at maybe 2:15? Crystal, is that okay if we do a break?
You're the boss. Sounds great.
Okay, all right. Well, let's do that. If you so let's take a 5-minute break. I'll let you do a stretch break, and I'll expect to see everybody back and don't log out of the session. I think you can just maybe, if you want to take yourself off of the camera, you can, but stay logged in. But if you need to step away for a break, we'll understand, and we'll resume the content at 2:15. All right, thanks. we can be nice and focused headed into the next section here, which is where, as I mentioned, I really want to turn and ask you about where are the 5 generations in the communication audiences you work with. And I prepared this view with Trenton in the Lawrence office to just get a feel for what are some of the audiences that you work with, and just so that we can start to think about where do you find the 5 generations in your communication audiences. So where would you place the generations now? And then also, where might you place them 5, 10, or 15 years from now? But we'll start with now. And please feel free to come off mute and come up and share your thoughts. So anybody who'd like to kick us off, when you look at this diagram of your different audiences in DECA, where are the generations there?
So like foster parents, you have millennials and Gen Xers, and then, but you definitely have baby boomers, because they're like retired and they feel like they have time and they've already raised kids, so they know how, and so you got kind of a range there.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not very many of the silent generation by then.
That's an interesting question about the silent generation, though. Are they anywhere when you look at this list?
They are. They're at the board.
Good one. Yeah.
There are still some board members that would be considered silent. And that spans about 4 of your 5, the board does. So it goes from very young to very old.
Well,
so it's a real unique group of individuals.
Sounds like a balanced board. That's probably a really good group. Yeah.
I see some in the coalitions that I work with too.
And some of the volunteers that you're going to have a variety, so that could span all 4 of those as well.
In the traffic safety world, we've definitely got clients that are the silent generation, as we're trying to not teach them, but subtly suggest how they can or maybe should not be driving anymore, and figuring out how to communicate with them in their way.
Joy just mentioned in the chat they're in the coalitions too. Yeah. What else do you see when you see this diagram? Where else do you see the generations?
Millennials probably are more in the intern students, volunteers, and maybe some of our, what is it, generation, what's the newest generation, Y?
Z.
Z.
Yeah, so Generation Z will probably be the foster children.
Could be a biological parents too, though. You could have some pretty young parents.
Mm-hmm.
Traffic safety has the SAFE program, so they have a lot to deal with the newest generation.
How about when it comes to things like government entities, regulators, contractors you all work with?
I think you have baby boomers and you have Generation X and you probably have some millennials.
You maybe even have some silent with government entities. Maybe a few left.
I'm going to put a few other questions up here that I actually want you all to try to tackle in a breakout room. So when you look at your work environment and these different audiences, where could generational misunderstandings occur? And then what are the perspectives and needs of each audience based on their generational profile? And I know you might not be able to tackle every single one on the chart here, but perhaps you could pick 2 or 3 to answer that. So I'm going to ask Crystal to send you into a breakout room so that you can chat with each other in a little bit more comfortable way. And those are the 2 questions we're looking to answer here. Where could generational misunderstandings occur? And what are the kind of perspectives and needs of each of these audiences based on their generational profile? And again, you can pick a few to hone in on if you'd like to. And then when you're done, I'd like for your group to come back out to the big room when the group discussion ends, and we'll do a little debrief, and you can tell us what if you guys had what your insights were about those 2 questions. I know the materials for today were sent out to people by email, so I think you're going to lose access to this slide when you go to your breakout room, but it is in I sent you both the PowerPoint and the handouts for today, and you can find this slide in both of those documents. So if you want to get it up on your own device, you sure can. All right, well, let's break out. Let's give everybody about, Crystal, let's go for a 10-minute discussion. And then everybody can, take some notes on what you're talking about so that you can share it with us when you come back out. Back, everybody. Just put something in the chat here. So I just put the 2 questions we're focused on here. I just put in the chat just to remind us. So where could generational misunderstandings occur? And what are the perspectives and needs of certain audiences based on what you know about their generational profile? And I think I spelled that wrong, sorry. Let's have the first group. Who are the members of that first group, Crystal?
I just clicked out of it to recreate the groups.
No problem at all. And that reminds me, for exercise later in the afternoon, we are going to group by generation. So if you wouldn't mind just putting in the chat what your generation is, that'll help Crystal get you in the right place too. And then we'll probably have the Lawrence group be a group together for that again, even if you have multiple generations.
Hey, good call on the ice cream. Put it in the dishwasher.
Okay. Laura was in group 4 and her mic is open, so she might be wanting to talk. I do remember that.
Yeah, we just nominate group 4.
Yep, Laura was in group 4.
Oh, good. All right, so Laura and your group, why don't you guys come forward and share with us what you talked about? What did your discussion look like?
Okay, sorry about that. I was talking to my children.
Oh, yeah, understandable. No problem.
I think to generalize, we talked a lot about communication styles and how that can be kind of the bump, how each different generation communicates. And Joy brought up language and how words mean different things to different generations. Thongs, for example. And not just what they mean, but how many words, new words there are for younger people now that older adults have zero clue what what it means or how it's used, the context. And then along with that, we talked about how presenting information to specific generations is something that we all have to consider and think about. Make sure we're presenting it like using the right words, the right colors, the right logos, and not only an attractive and appropriate manner to not offend anyone, because that's real, but also to hook the audience that we're trying to reach.
Mm.
And again, sorry about the ice cream thing, guys.
Oh no, that's good. I'm glad we got to hear from you. And did your group come up with any, did you guys talk about any specific examples?
I don't know, group 4, did we have specifics?
Just the language with the thong.
Thongs, that just kind of sticks out.
And were there some, when we look at the entities on the screen, were there some that you really focused on? What types of communication audiences did the conversation bring up?
Clients, definitely clients in behavioral health, foster care. We didn't necessarily talk about this, but it's just coming to my mind. Contractors, regulators, like something that I think about when I'm, writing reports or putting together reports, making sure I use the right format and verbiage to to express how much we're doing and how great it is, but not too wordy, so we can impress our funders, keep the government happy, but still describe in a clear, concise manner the work that we're doing.
Okay, good. Okay, let me grab another group. Is there another group that'd be willing to come forward?
So in our group, we had an interesting distinction because we had Carrie, who I just looked at the things as a baby boomer, and she's looking at new finance systems. And she's like, is this going to last us for the next 10 years? And I was like, well, I'm a millennial and I don't see why it has to last for 10 years. Like, can it last for 3? Can we just get something else when this is outdated? And she was like, huh. So
I'm not here to put it in. I don't care, Sarah.
So I view it as a lot more dispensable, and she views it as something long-term, which I thought was a really interesting distinction. And so that was like a non-direct service staff, so like the behind the scenes, keeping everybody together kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great example.
We mentioned foster parents just a little bit because you do have a big gap you have a big range of people who are parenting kids who could be like their grandkids' age, or you have people parenting kids that are their own kids' age. So.
Mm-hmm.
And I learned there are people who don't know how to read cursive writing in the group.
Oh yeah, we talked about cursive writing too, and presenting in cursive writing.
Yeah, and what was the discussion around that? Did anybody else find that to be true, or what were you thinking?
Well, the millennials in the group said we can write it, but we don't read it very well because we're not used to looking at it. We're used to looking at screen print. So yeah, but we learned how to write it.
In schools, they're beginning to teach it again. They have stopped teaching it for a while.
You think they started again? That may have a little bit of old information on that there was a little bit of, do you think there was some pushback, or what led to them starting again?
I think and this is me, I used to teach preschool, so I didn't teach secondary education, but from word of mouth, I've heard that because children couldn't read it and it was becoming an issue because it would still come up. They kind of looked at it like it was a discontinued, something that they didn't need to learn, and then realized that kids were coming up with problems in jobs and college because they couldn't read it. So I believe it's being re-implemented.
So working with community coalitions, I love cursive writing. I love to write cursive, but being a part of the training team and working with coalitions, I've had to learn how to print when I do presentations instead of write because some people couldn't read it. So
Great example. Yeah.
We also talked about there are 3 solid generational bands that work at DECA now, but soon we'll have that 4th one, that generation Y will come into play in the next 5 years, when we were talking 5, 10, 15 years. And that will change it. And I think we will still have some of the original band in there. So that'll be the first time we have 4 generations, 4 generational bands at DECA. And I think we'll see that moving forward quite a bit.
And what roles do you think you'll see them in first?
The Generation Y will come in. I mean, they will come in some of the service delivery, some of the administrative probably. It'll take a while to get to a leadership role, I think. So that will hover and that will start to, and has already started to transition a little bit, as it should.
And do you all ever work with maybe student social workers or people who are coming in kind of like a apprenticeship or like a learning role?
I don't, but there are those in the organization that do. So yes, DECA does have internships and practicums and other arrangements with universities and colleges.
Yeah, practicum, thank you, that's the word. Yeah. Good, any other observations from that group about where misunderstandings could occur or what the needs of certain groups might be? Okay, well let's get the next group up. Who'd be willing to step forward for the next group?
This is Diane, and I was part of group 3. On some of the misunderstandings, we talked some, not specifically about work, but even children interacting, meaning teens interacting with us, and just their attention to news and events by virtue of always being on their devices, and just their interpretation of what's important and things we don't even necessarily know about, or what's going on with celebrities or things that way.
Yeah.
We also talked about some of the same things that were mentioned in the first group with perspectives. I wrote down know your audience and language matters and being inclusive, and those were all mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. All right, and I think there's one last group out there. Tell us what takeaways you had.
That would be the Lawrence group.
I think the biggest one was the difference in technology, which I think we've kind of covered a little bit. And then communication styles. I think the older generations are maybe a little bit more professional, and the younger generations are okay with communicating via text.
Yeah, text is an interesting one. Where are there certain situations where you'd see that come up in your in your workflow? Where would kind of something like that pop up?
I think, with some of our foster families, I think they like to communicate back and forth with their workers via text. For some it's easier, for others it's not. I think it's also a much more instant line of communication that maybe some older generations haven't been used to, so. And then another one was maybe like attire. I think the younger generations are much more free-spirited, I guess, and maybe the older generations, like my grandfather, would wear a suit and tie to work every day, so. What else would that be?
Yeah, attire, that's a good one. Where, are there certain audiences where attire is an issue?
Over the years at our organization, I think there's been some friendly reminders of what's appropriate to wear to work. Like, yoga pants aren't always appropriate. And, I think 25 years ago, it just would have completely been a non-topic, so.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, what else are you guys thinking? Anything else come up?
Sherry mentioned verbiage, like sometimes communicating with her granddaughter. I think she would use like text that Sherry didn't always necessarily understand. So some of the lingo.
Okay. Good. Well, what do you think? Before we close out this discussion, other thoughts about where you're finding the generations as you go through your workday, where you're interacting with them? Is there anyone who thinks that they come pretty close to interacting with all the generations on a given day? Is there anybody who, when you look at your work week, you're really working with all of them?
Yeah, I have all of them on my staff.
And really,
yeah. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Our client population for drug and alcohol is, the rehab's not an age group. It knows no age. So the client population we serve, really doesn't care about age. So you see the group of people we work with, and they don't really care about age.
Yeah. Interesting. And yet I wonder if, let's take that as an example. Is there anything about their generational lens, though, that might impact their recovery? It's kind of a big question, and anybody's welcome to jump in, but how could we customize for them based on this? And I realize that humans are made up of a lot of different factors, but if we're just looking at these generational impacts.
Maybe for older generations, there's more stigma. It seems like we're having more conversations around it now as younger millennial, I don't know, I can only speak from my spot, but it seems like maybe there's more of a stigma around it. So making them feel like that this is okay, it's okay that you're here and it's a good thing, and trying to break down that barrier.
That's a great observation, Sarah. Yeah. How else does generation impact those programs? are certain groups more or less likely to want to be part of like group activity, or do you see any generational differences based on that? Like their desire to kind of bounce off of and use the other people around them?
As a millennial, I'm all about group activities and working together as a team and like getting feedback and making sure that everyone is happy with things, as long as you don't take too long to decide, because we've got things to do and I want you to be involved on my schedule.
Okay, good. Well, I think that's a kind of thing that you might be able to look at going forward. And I realize that, treatment programs are just one. You all have such a diverse organization. You do so many things, but we were just going to take that one type of programming and look at people that come to you, and it sounds like it's a really diverse group. But what could be those people's relationship to substance abuse or to their treatment or to their recovery based on the generation that they're from, based on some of these generational traits that we've been talking about? What types of activities would benefit them the most? Where would their comfort zone be? Where can you help push them out of their comfort zone for a breakthrough? I think those are the kind of things that if the work group that does that kind of work reflected on today's session after the fact, and you kind of looked at it through this lens to say, are there some ways we can target our programming generationally? It'd be interesting to see what you came up with. And I know that's probably not something you're going to solve with me putting on the spot right now, but if you look at these different audiences you're working with and the different programs that branch out from them and really say, what's some customizing we can do based on the needs of those generations, it'd be interesting to see if that led to a few new ideas or new ways of doing something that would be really impactful. Yeah, so this, this, I think going for the rest of the afternoon, you'll probably hear me say this a few times, but this is an image that you might return to with your division or your work group again to sort of say, hey, which of these belong to us, and where can we be thinking through different generational lenses to impact programming or to impact our outcomes. Well, let's go to the idea of communicating with the different generations. Now that we've kind of challenged ourselves to think through who are they, where are they at DECA, now we can talk about, okay, well, how do we communicate with them effectively? And how can we adapt our communication to some generational differences? And this is an image, I realize it's probably small on your screen, but you do have this in your handout form as well. So we'll start with silent generation. So for this group, they may not ruffle feathers or initiate conflict, so it's good to do a check-in to be sure that you have their buy-in, using testimonials or expert opinion to persuade them, not rushing them or pressuring them to make a decision. This group kind of likes to take their time and think something through. Offering them time with others that give them social connectedness could be really valuable to them. Promoting teamwork and doing more with less. Relying on the rules of conduct, respect for authority, more of a top-down chain of command approach. Providing detailed instructions on how to do something could be helpful. And then for this group, I realized for them, it sounds like we've got them more perhaps in volunteer roles or board membership roles. They kind of look at tried and true ways of recognition. Things like, I'm getting paid for a job well done, or I'm getting a plaque or a photo with the CEO. Those old-fashioned elements of recognition probably mean something for this group. And then in terms of performance review, sort of no news is good news. That if they don't hear something's wrong, they'll assume all is well. For boomers, so provide knowledge, let this group see the big picture, offer them a new experience or adventure. Provide choices and let them weigh their options, discuss technology, talk about their well-being, help them see that they are ageless, that they've got a lot of potential, be future-focused, check with them about their comfort level with texting. So I know a lot of boomers embrace texting and they're on board. Others, hey, they'd rather that you place a phone call or shoot them an email. So I think that's a group to just do that check when you first establish a work relationship with them. Just be like, hey, do you text, or would you rather we do something different? This group, gauge their interest in traditional social media like LinkedIn, Facebook, or other platforms. This group wants to feel valued and be asked for their input. So they're good at learning through collegiality and positive relationships. They see performance review as something that happens once a year, and they really look for those thank yous and attaboys. So giving this group this kind of personal praise when they've done something impactful. Boomers, how do you react to that list? Is there anything there that resonated with you or things you would add? If you're in that category, what do you think about communication tips for communicating with you? Who has something to add to that? Can you either put it in the chat or come up and speak?
Got nothing.
Hey, baby boomers, how do you like to be communicated with? Is there anything here that sounded right? Did I totally nail it? Are you all doing other things?
I don't think this group of baby boomers likes to text, so they'd probably like to be face to face.
So they'd be much more responsive to me if we were all in one room?
Maybe.
Understandable.
Yes, that's for sure. I mean, I like to text, but I'd rather talk on the phone, but my favorite is in person.
Yeah. And what do you like about that?
About in person?
Yeah. What makes the difference for that? Why is that better?
It energizes me. And plus you can read the room, and a text sometimes can come across different than how you intended it to.
Yeah.
So these misunderstandings, but I just like being around people.
Yeah, good point. So anybody who communicates with baby boomers often in your role, what about this list resonated with you? Anything you'd add to it or that you thought was true?
I think that boomers, like I do agree that they are interested in traditional social media sites like Facebook and LinkedIn, but it's very like intentional and purposeful. And like no offense to anybody, but if you don't like this, then you're not going to heaven kind of.
Sarah. Maybe it's more of a broadcast rather than it's a tool for conversation.
Yeah, like.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's pivot to Gen X, and there are going to be fewer of them, but some tips for them. So share images and graphics to get buy-in, because I do think this tends to be one of the first a little bit more sort of tactile and visual generations. Let them make a decision at their own pace. Avoid hard selling techniques with this group. Offer suggestions rather than telling them what to do because of that independence. Provide a variety of choices. Promote quality. Deliver what you promised or you'll be dropped. So they're really looking for people to take action and be genuine. Steer away from anything that threatens their lifestyle, be it political, social, or business. Get straight to the point rather than hinting at something. Let them get to know you and trust you. Help them see how collaboration and information sharing matters, because that might not be their first default mode for Gen Xers. They're probably more likely to want to work on something independently. Organizational rewards may not mean as much to them as something like paid time off or cash rewards. They may have a sorry to interrupt, how am I doing approach to a performance review, as opposed to the millennials who want the constant feedback. So it may be harder to catch them to kind of give that feedback if they're not quite as communicative. So what do you think? People who are members of that generation, Gen Xers, what about this made sense to you? You can either put things in the chat or speak up. Any of this sound like you? Anything you'd add? How should we communicate with you?
This is Dina, and I like images and graphics. I'm very visual, so that would be one of them. And I like it when it's straight to the point rather than hinting around to something.
Yeah, good. So that resonated. Good. Anything else?
I'm also a Gen X, and I would say very much so. I'm very visual. I like the, offer suggestions, but I'm very independent. I know what I want. I do identify with deliver what you promised, be true to your word. So I can resonate with that.
Good. Thanks for sharing. Give me maybe one more. Is there one more Gen Xer who would speak up?
This is our largest group, is actually Gen X.
Oh, is it? Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. Maybe that's why we got crickets from the boomers.
I'm part of the Gen X group, and I'm one of those that deliver what you promised, get straight to the point. I don't like hints. As part of the retention team here, everybody seems to want the paid time off or cash rewards as opposed to the other stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely, sorry to interrupt, but how am I doing?
And so how does that sound if you approach a supervisor or mentor of yours in that? What does that kind of sound like?
For
when you're kind of asking for guidance or that, hey, sorry to interrupt, but how am I doing? What would a conversation with like that sort of sound like?
That would be pretty much it. I would just walk up and say, what do you want me to do? What do you need me to do? Am I doing what you want me to do?
Good. Good. Yep. Great. Good. So it sounds like some of that resonated with the Gen Xers. That's great. So for millennials, know that they will be comfortable communicating through a lot of different mediums likely. So instant message, text, email, video conference, social networks. So it may mean that we need to set boundaries with millennials on when certain communication mediums are preferred. If you don't want them to text you or you don't want a certain medium used, you may need to be clear about boundaries. Make the organizational culture unwritten rules part of the onboarding and orientation for them. Again, because they just may not have that sixth sense about what's allowed or what's expected that previous generations just sort of came in knowing. Give them mentors or coaches. Give them feedback on their ideas. Be transparent. Leverage their enthusiasm and pockets of knowledge. Share how what you will do will be an ethical solution to help their community. Approach them on both a local and global level. Invite friends or family to be involved. I know that sounds like kind of a silly one, but some companies, as they onboard brand new college graduates, they're having a day or a night where family can come check out your office, or we're onboarding a big. This would be like large companies, but this is a place in our cycle where we're onboarding a big group of people. We're going to have a family night and let you invite mom and dad to come check out where you work. Do your homework on them as they will have done it on you. Spell out the directions and parameters clearly. They may have a hard time with independent problem solving. Let them communicate online for convenience when appropriate. And then these folks might be more motivated by experiences or non-tangible. So we've got, the Gen Xers who are kind of not so interested in those organizational rewards, but they might want the paid time off or cash rewards. Not to say that millennials would, I guess, turn those things down, but I do think millennials get sort of motivated by things like, we want to send you to a conference to go have an experience or learn something new, or we're going to invest in you to go get a micro certification somewhere, or, something like that where you're providing them a chance to have an experience or something that's a non-tangible. Can be motivational for them. And then give continuous feedback, be open to frequent check-ins from that group. So millennials, what do you think? When we go through that list, what resonated, what sounds true, anything you'd add, anything you disagree with? You can either add it to the chat or come forward and speak.
This is Laura. I said I denied my millennial generation, but y'all, all of that is me, all of it. The one that I laughed about most was do homework on them. Like I remember years ago, like seeing applications or hearing of people that applied to work at DECA, and I'm like, Facebook, oh, they used to work here and they know this person. And coworkers in, boomer generations are like, oh, we can't do that. We can't look on Facebook. And I'm like, what do you mean we can't look on, like, we got to know about them, and this is how we know about them. And then the transparency thing. I would totally have told the person, like, oh, I looked you up on Facebook and noticed, blah, 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 which, P.S., I don't work in HR, so maybe I shouldn't do that. I never did it, Janet. I didn't ever do that. But yeah, this is I think a good list of.
Good, thank you. Yeah, great thoughts. That was really helpful. Looks like from the Lawrence group, we're getting some feedback. Comfortable with technology, flexible direction, experiences over money, all resonate with millennials here. And they're calling Laura a millennial stalker. Oh, that's funny. Good. Yeah. Okay. Let me hear from maybe one other person in that category. Anything else that Laura said it all kind of made sense to her, but anybody else have one or two things that stood out or something you'd add?
I definitely agree with the transparency thing, and then I always want like clear directions, because I find myself being frustrated if I'm like having to guess what is expected of me. So I definitely like love like clear directions.
Good. I'll share some here for Gen Z too. So give them options for communicating through text or instant message. Confirm you have their live attention since they are so immersed. Be vocal about boundaries on the presence of electronic devices. They will want information immediately and have the tools at their disposal to get it. Help them distinguish between real and constructed reality. So what is that online life versus the real life? Refrain from formality when possible. Get them to feel a connection to your idea or brand. Tap into different learning styles and customize. I think that's a big one for this Gen Z, is that they really like the idea that things can and should be customized to them. Give them some structure. Help them focus and find the difference between the signal and the noise. How does that resonate when you think about the Gen Zers in your own life? Maybe the people under 20 that you know that are your kids or your family members, or even the maybe the foster children that you work with. Does any of that make sense? What would we add to that list? What do you think? Anybody out there that intersects with those Gen Z folks? Yeah, that they all have a different learning style. It's a good one. Setting boundaries on devices. That was something that came up when I met in person with the Lawrence office about a year ago to talk through these issues with them, was the idea that that when children are placed with a family, that they have that device taken away, or that there are rules around that, and that was causing some challenges. Has anybody dealt with that? Maybe not. Okay, might have just been some of the case managers in the Lawrence office that were thinking about that. Well, some things to consider. Let's try to make this a little bit more real by giving you some communication scenarios. So anticipating a communication scenario with these different groups. So for baby boomers, communicating with a baby boomer, scenario that we came up with for that was health insurance benefits are changing and a baby boomer colleague is concerned. So some things to ask ourselves here. What might the generation listed, how might they see the communication situation? In what ways could both of your generational lenses affect the interaction? How can you best adapt your communication to that audience, and how could you best support the other person to adapt if they were the one that needed to adapt? So let's start with that one. The idea that health insurance benefits are changing and a baby boomer colleague is concerned. How would you handle that? Has anybody ever faced something similar on the job? So what could be the baby boomers' outlook on that? Let's start with that. Why might that worry them?
Let's be honest, they're old and they need insurance, okay?
Yeah, I think that when Janet and Trent and I were talking through these scenarios, that was kind of the idea. That's so true.
I know a lot of baby boomers that are working way past where they should because they can't afford to not work and try to pay the insurance themselves. And also, it seems like the deductibles are going higher and higher for less coverage.
Great point.
And I'm assuming that this would imply that the benefits are being decreased, not increased, because those would be two different conversations.
Good question. But maybe even just some trepidation around the fact that it's changing. Whereas perhaps a different generation might think, okay, that's fine. Yeah. So how would we, what do you think? Thoughts on how to handle that? How would we adapt our communication in that situation? You know, those of you that were saying this was really crucial to that generation, what does that mean they would need to hear or understand?
I think you'd have to address what the specific concerns are. And, you know, like Carrie was saying, does that mean that premiums are increasing for them? Does that mean coverage amounts are decreasing? So I think that that conversation really depends on what that specific concern is.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
I think you would need to share it as early as possible if there was a choice for them to make a decision on what package they might want, so that they have time to process it and think about it.
That's a really good point. And maybe make that decision tree really clear. Like, here are the specifics on different plans or different options. Yeah. Okay, well, let's take a Gen Z example here. A Gen Z foster child is feeling isolated from their friends because their electronic device was taken away when they were placed. What should we be thinking about with that one? How would they be seeing that? What's the lens the Gen Z are seeing that through?
They might feel that was a punitive measure, that that's punishment for taking that device away. When it might not be punishment, it might simply be something like limiting screen time or trying to get them involved in some other things or something else. But it's kind of their extension of their hand. It's there all the time. And so it feels very odd if they don't have the ability, I think, to touch it, to have it right there.
Yep. Good.
It might also have been taken away because they are trying to communicate with family that don't have rights to them anymore or whatever. A lot of foster kids want to be with their parents, and so it might be for their safety that it was taken away, but they see it as, and I mean, they're right, they would be totally isolated from their friends if it was summer or like they didn't see them at school. It would be a very isolating thing.
Yeah. So how can we adapt or help them adapt? Ideas on that? What's the communication adaptation here?
I think it would be important to address, are there criteria that they have to meet in order to get that device back? Or are there time frames, you know, that they can look forward to know that they can have it during, you know, this time frame?
Yeah. Good. We must have hit on a pretty good scenario on that one. That one feels pretty real to folks. Good. So for Gen Xers, one we thought of was a Gen X employee wants to use their paid time off rather than sick vacation time. I realize all this might not have been as relevant in 2020 with kind of the flexed work schedules we've been dealing with, but if we place our minds into a time where routine work schedules are back in force, what do you think? What would be the Gen Xers lens there? What are they thinking? What's their perspective going to be?
So I might be an outlier for Gen Xers here, but I prefer vacation time and then I prefer sick time. So I like that separate pool. So I'm not sure how I might change that scenario. So maybe I'm old school in that regard.
Okay. Has this been a contentious topic? I feel like when I met with the other offices, this one brought up a lot of discussion. What kind of are the dynamics around how you all take time off?
You know, it has come up, but I don't know if it was a particular generational issue. Because, yeah, I think there were some people who were valuing just this large pool of just time off in general, whereas other people were liking this bank of time, because here we can accrue more sick time than we can vacation time. So our sick time can be a larger pool, but in the event that you have a long-term illness or crisis of some sort, it's nice to have that security of the sick bank to be able to pull from.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, for refreshing me on that. I think that it seemed like the theme was that perhaps Boomer generation was really seeing that as important to them and wanting that, and yeah, but that other generations were kind of thinking, sort of time is time. I may want to go, you know, do any type of experience I want to have. Is that, you know, also and that what, you know, what does it mean to have that all sort of be counted the same, versus if you are someone who might have a bigger chance of having a health issue come up, having that sort of safety net of health time is pretty important. Yeah. What do you think? Other thoughts on this one? Or would you tweak that scenario a little bit? Gen Xers, what? You know, how do you see your time in relationship to the organization? Well, that's kind of a big question, but
I think for me, I'm balancing like what they were saying Gen Xers do is aging parents and parenting and work. So I have actually, I'm 45, I have little people, and we have very aged parents in their 70s. So we were late bloomers as parents, so we have little people and parents that are starting to have real troubles like breast cancer. And so it is, the way I see work-life balance is probably different than a lot of people in other places, even within my own Generation X, is because we're the atypical parent, maybe, being on the older end and having young people, and then our parents are much older. So we're kind of at the extremes here a little bit, but it's hard to balance everything. It's it's a lot. We care for a lot of people. We deal with a lot of probably why I work in this industry is people matter to me. But it's a big balance. It's a big work-life balance is a daily conversation. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. Really feeling the crunch as that sandwich generation in the middle. Yeah. Okay, and we got some information from the chat. Sounds like from the Lawrence group, they're saying the Gen Xers here don't want to be forced to use the paid time off, and we're seeing some agreement there. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's an interesting, even if my scenario here didn't quite nail the dynamic, I think, you know, something like time off, it speaks to how our lives intersect with the organization. And that is definitely a larger question that the generational lens has a lot to do with. That, you know, so I just think this is a good question. If different employees are having different perspectives on this or asking for different things, this is one area where you might be able to look to the generational lens to help explain what their perspective is or why they're seeing it differently than you are. I just know sometimes we get, a lot of times people who become benefits managers are in a more mature stage of their career, and this just might be a tool to understand how different generations might be approaching those benefits differently. Okay, yeah.
I had heard someone at one point and this was a real discussion that was going on about paid time off, that vacation was to use for something that you wanted to do that was fun. It shouldn't have to be used for something that you needed to do, like get your oil changed or something like that. So I think the concept of what vacation is for resonates differently with different generations. Whereas I might go, oh, well, you know, it's a vacation day. I have time off. I can go get my oil change if I want to. And I wouldn't maybe think anything of using vacation, but, you know, obviously it's not fun. So, yeah, so just the concept of what that means and what the connotation behind what those categories are seem to have some discussion around it all by itself.
Yeah. Oh, beautifully said. Thank you, Carrie. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's look at the next one. A silent generation board member asked for printed materials about a new treatment model. So we were just sort of thinking about how do we adapt to that group that might not be as in touch with what's going on digitally or the website or email.
You don't. You just print it.
Yeah. Has anybody run into a situation like this where you had to make that kind of adaptation?
Yeah, I've had board members ask to have something printed, and I just say certainly and let them know it'll be an envelope at the front desk and they can pick it up.
Yeah. And then they get to come in and say hello to everyone, which they probably value too, right? So, yeah.
I'll see this though at Gen Xers with digital copies when I do trainings. A lot of times people want the tangible book. And it's usually the Gen Xers that'll ask for it in foster parent training, is they like the fillable documents for maybe handing things in, but to actually read something, they like the copy. So this may be multi-generational.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I hate to say I'm kind of a paper person too, so maybe that one is a little more individual. And then lastly, for millennials, scenario with a millennial, communicating with a millennial. A millennial employee would like to use flex time or our office outside of the building on certain days. And again, I think that if we're kind of thinking about maybe what the rules were before the pandemic, it could be that people are more open to that working than they were before. But yeah, just curious, what do you think? What's the generational lens they're seeing that through? How do we adapt? What are kind of the intersections on that one? Are there any millennials who wanted to have a setup like that more permanently? What would be the benefits of something like that? Is there anything from your experiences during the shutdown that you hope might carry forward that's been a positive?
A big thing for me has been not commuting as much. It saves a lot of time during the day, and so then I have more time with my family in the evening, and it's really nice.
Yeah, good.
And also I could do like little chores, like I could go throw in a load of laundry in between stuff that I was doing. And so on the weekends, I didn't feel like I was just catching up the whole time. Yeah.
Yeah. And what does this scenario have to do with millennials' relationship to the organization? Like, how are they seeing, if a millennial asks for something like this, in what ways are they seeing their relationship to their work differently than somebody else?
You know, I would say maybe people are feeling like maybe older generations feel more connection to their coworkers if they're in office, whereas millennials, because they can connect virtually in other ways, they have the higher comfort level with that because that's how they've kind of grown up with stuff. Maybe they feel less connection to an office space per se, and there's less ownership of, oh, here's my desk and here's my stuff per se. And I don't know if that's the case, but that could be one interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to take this a step further here and talk a little bit about navigating organizational impacts kind of at a organizational level. So we've talked about who are the generations, how do we communicate with them. Now we want to kind of zoom out and think about how does DECA as an entity support or not support or interact with these generations. And I want to start this just by talking about the different cycles and archetypes in the generational cycle. So there's a group of folks that study this that have a theory where they say that there are really 4 different generational cycles that just keep repeating themselves. And I put some of this, if you want to read more about it, I put some of it in your the handouts that I sent to you. But basically what they're saying is there are different turnings or sort of social orders or mood eras in the country, and then different archetypes kind of emerge or are reacting to that, and that we see this just repeated again and again, those same cycles all the way back to, they have it going back to like the 1400s. It's kind of interesting to think about though. So for first one would be the turning they call high, which is like a post-crisis era where institutions are strong. And the generation that kind of comes in and reacts to that is a prophet generation. So born at the near the end of a crisis during a time of rejuvenated community life and consensus around a new social order, prophets grow up as increasingly indulged children of the post-crisis era, come of age as self-absorbed young crusaders of an awakening, focus on morals and principles in midlife, and emerge as elders guiding another crisis. So I realize that's a lot of just language from those authors, but basically that is that boomer group. Next one, awakening, where institutions are attacked in the name of personal autonomy. And then the next group that comes in, they call the nomad generation, and these are the Gen Xers. So born during an awakening, a time of social ideals and spiritual agendas when young adults are passionately attacking the established institutional order. Nomads grow up as underprotected children during this awakening, come of age as alienated post-awakening adults, become pragmatic midlife leaders during a crisis, and age into resilient post-crisis elders. Next one for unraveling, where institutions are weak and are not trusted and individualism flourishes. And then the generation there would be the millennials, and that archetype they call the hero generation. Born after an awakening during an unraveling, a time of individual pragmatism, self-reliance, and laissez-faire, heroes grow up as increasingly protected post-awakening children, come of age as team-oriented young optimists during a crisis, and emerge as energetic, overly confident midlifers, and age into politically powerful elders attacked by another awakening. And then the last one here, crisis, where institutional life is rebuilt in response to perceived threat that the nation's survival, civic authority is reinstated, engagement returned, sense of community purpose. People see themselves as members of a larger group, have more of a collective confidence. And that actually is the silent generation. But if we look at this as a cycle, it's also Gen Z, which to me is so interesting. That if this theory is true, that this is a kind of a four-wave cycle that always repeats, then the Generation Z that's coming up right now is really going to have a lot in common with the silent generation. And the way they determine this is sort of by like economic trends, that these economic trends happen in these 20-year cycles as well, and that just happens to then capture these generational lenses that the groups end up having because of kind of the political and economic cycle that they grew up in, and that this is sort of fairly consistently repeats. But I think that's really interesting that we can kind of think about the silent generation perhaps having some of the same traits as Gen Z, and I think that's been somewhat true, that they are growing up in a time where, you know, institutions are a little bit stronger or more heavy-handed, that we're having to take a more collective look at what we're doing. Everyone has to sort of pull together to solve a countrywide or global-wide problem. I think that was already kind of true, and then adding the pandemic into that, I think almost plays into that even more, that those two generations, like the folks that were shaped by the Great Depression and World War II, have kind of had a similar upbringing to Gen Z. So it's just interesting to think over time how those cycles might impact. And again, if you're interested in reading more about the author's language on that and what they're saying, you can definitely do that in the handouts that I gave you. And you might want to even get their book and dig into that even more. Next step in that, though, is just try to customize a little bit in the organization by generation. And here are some questions I'd like for you to think about in your generational groups that Crystal will send you to in a minute. I'd like for each group to take one generation, your own generation, and try to build a profile of that generation in the organization by considering a few things. What are your goals in your current career stage? You know, and by implication there, how might those be different from the folks around you? What are your goals for your future and your life outside of work? What are your goals for the organization? What are your priorities? What rewards would be meaningful to you? And then what might you need at different stages in your employment? When you think about the life cycle of employee, being recruited, orientation, first day on the job, first year on the job, performance review, first promotion, first management role, looking ahead at retirement. You know, what kinds of things will your generation need as you go through that life cycle of an employee? So I'm going to ask Crystal to send you out to your groups, and she's got you organized by generation this time. So you're just kind of talking with the folks in your same cohort and saying, you know, basically, how could DECA better meet the needs of our generational cohort by answering these questions? So let's make this I want to give you a little bit longer. Let's make this maybe a 15-minute discussion, and then you can come out and debrief and tell us what were some new ideas or some consensus points that you came up with in your generational group. So we're only going to have 3 here. We'll have Millennials, Gen X, and Baby Boomers.
Right, and then we'll also, the Lawrence group, you get to pick and decide what group you want to be, because you'll be your own group.
All right, interested to hear what you come up with. I really appreciate this exercise. Thank you for the voice that, you know, everybody gave to their own cohort. I think it's really great for us to hear the differences in how these questions got answered by each group, and even some of the similarities. I think there's some themes that run through, but it is really interesting to think about how might we be able to customize and what really is important to each group. And I think a little bit of that is informed by life stage. So this is where we might want to make that distinction between what's someone's generational lens, knowing that each generation is going to go through every life stage, versus, you know, what does it really mean to be in a certain life stage, to be closer to retirement, or to be parenting, or to be just starting out in your career. And I think it's wise for organizations and leaders and managers to be thinking on all of those levels. Like, you know, what's a sort of a shared experience that we would face as we all head toward retirement, but also how are baby boomers in particular as a group looking at retirement? And I think they're kind of looking at it differently than their parents did, and what does that mean for an organization like yours? So anyhow, it could be some good questions to continue to ponder. And I've got one more that I think fits into that, and this is also in the handouts I gave you all. But I guess it'd be interesting we won't really pull this apart together here, but if I was going to assign sort of one piece of homework to folks, it would be to have some conversations around this graphic, to really ask ourselves to break down that life cycle. This is kind of zooming in on that life cycle question I had at the end of the last slide, to say, we look at all the different phases a employee might go through. And we said that was recruitment, orientation that they get, their first day or first 30 days on the job, first year, getting a new project assignment, a performance review, a first promotion, having ongoing leadership or management duties. What would be important to DECA in that stage? Like, what is it that you need to get out of that? And you're onboarding a new employee, or you're promoting them to a managerial role. What matters to the company? I know you're not a company, organization. What will be important to each group in that stage? And then what action can you take? What programs could be implemented? What are you willing to try to do differently? What could we do more that is working? So what are we already doing that you like, that's working, that we could do more of? And I think these could just be even little tweaks that would make a difference. So again, I don't know that these are necessarily questions that we will answer here in the next 15 minutes, but I think something like this could be an interesting discussion piece for you to pull forward. And it could be that there could be some changes or initiatives that come out of this that might make a difference. You know, perhaps you look at Gen Zers that might be coming on as recent interns in their practicums, and you might say, gosh, you know, we really need to build out a pre-orientation program where they learn some things about us before they even step foot into our programs. Or, you know, maybe you look at this and say, boy, we've got some Gen Xers right now who really have some wisdom to share because of the stage of career that they're in. How do we set up a mentorship program where, as they take on leadership and management duties, they're reaching down to mentor others, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of ways we could start to conceptualize this, but I think it'd be an interesting thing for you all to think about, you know, as an organization going forward, and maybe use this as a springboard for, and a kind of a framework for moving forward. But to close us out here, I just wanted to hear from folks as we wrap up. You know, what do you understand differently about the workplace generations now? Any kind of perspectives on your generation or on generations that shifted or deepened? How do you think you could use this in your life, your department, on your team? And then what will you do to kind of keep the conversation going with others that weren't here today? So let's just end with that. Could I hear from a few voices on answers to any of this? Basically, I guess if I'm going to sum this up, it would be takeaways. What are your takeaways from the afternoon?
I would say one of the things that stands out to me was the piece, it was one of the charts where you were showing kind of how they look in the workplace, and there was a comment about millennials needing very clear direction and directives. That's not typically how I operate. I usually tell people, here's the task, and then do it how you'd like to do it. And I've found that that is hard for millennials. And so to see that, they really do need, here's kind of how I want it done. Here's the container for it, instead of not setting a container. So I think this is a good reinforcer of, oh yes, really need to set a container.
Yeah, that's a good takeaway.
So listening to what we've talked about today, and then thinking about our community groups and how then I can best communicate to them, is just reinforcing that people are in different stages, and so they have so only so much time, especially being that sandwich generation. So maybe the communication needs to be about where we are all at, and how much time that we can give to different things, and that's okay.
Good. Sounds like the Lawrence group is on the chat saying, be more understanding of others' priorities and goals. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, and then just kind of adding that generational lens to our empathy toolkit, that this is one more way to understand how someone else may have a different view. I like that. Yeah. Other takeaways, anything else that you thought was valuable or that might be impactful for you?
So one of the things that really caught my eye was talking about when you talked about some individuals might be kind of in between two generations, and recognizing that they might operate a little bit out of both versus just out of their actual generation they might be in.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. Good point. Yeah, if you're on the cusp of the generation, if you're right on the edge, you may feel that you've got traits of both and feel a little torn, and that's okay. That's interesting too. There's some things out there that you can search about those cusp generations, that they're almost their own micro generations. So within the generations, we can break it down into micro. Yes, Sarah. Yeah, we can break it down into micro generations as well, and you can kind of look into that a little bit too. Especially, I think that group who are the very first millennials, right on that crossover between Xers and millennials. There's a group of millennials who's a really strong microgeneration, to where they share some millennial traits, but they also got all of their schooling and kind of all their high school and college years completed before Facebook. And so they just kind of have a different relationship to that kind of technology than to people who are actively using that when they were in school. And that's an interesting microgeneration to look at if you're looking for one to kind of look into. Yeah.
One of the things that I thought about a lot was the Generation Z and how you made associations with the silent generation, and how just watching that unravel, I guess, watching that build itself into how it will look and how we will receive them in the workplace, and just having maybe a little perspective on what it might look like gives us some sort of idea of what it will be like, and how to approach them, and how to include them in the overall goals of the organization, or just helping them move forward and be a part of all of that 4-generation kind of loop that's going to happen.
Let me hear from, before we close out, let me hear from maybe 2 more people. What were some other takeaways? Lawrence group, what do you guys think? Any feedback from you?
No, it's on. Yeah. I think overall we enjoyed it. I thought it was a good discussion. It feels like I got to know people a little better in here. It was a good conversation. So
good. That's great. Wonderful. Well, I appreciate the chance to be with you all today. Thank you for your input and for being participants and for letting me experiment with this platform. I have to admit, I do workshops for organizations and companies all over the Kansas City area, but I have never conducted one over Zoom before. So thank you for hanging in there with me. This was good learning for me to sort of figure out what was working and what wasn't, so I'll reflect on that. And I know a lot of you do trainings as well, so as the recipient, you'll probably have noticed some things that you thought, hey, that worked or that didn't, and please make use of that knowledge. But thank you so much. I wish you all the best of luck, and I want to give a special thank you to Crystal for sort of being our platform manager today and for all of her help managing the communication. So thank you so much. It's been great to hear your stories and to learn with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks, Erin.
Thank you. Thank you.